Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. I'm delighted to introduce our two plenary speakers now. We first have Jennifer Rubin, who I'm sure many of you will recognise as Executive Chair of the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, the largest funder of social research in the UK. Better understanding, measuring and driving improvements in productivity is a current priority for the Council. Jennifer is also Professor of Public Policy at King's College London, where she was Director of the Policy Institute at King's before joining the UK Research and Innovation, UKRI, who many of us here are also familiar with. She spent nearly 30 years building and leading research programmes and institutes inside and outside academia to address a range of societal challenges spanning justice, home affairs, cross-cutting public health and new funding models for public services. And in this capacity, she's led cross-national comparative research and been an advisor on several reviews, focusing on the measurement and improving outcomes. She was on the executive team of the not-for-profit research institution, ran European offices, most recently as executive vice president. With that experience, there are very few people, there's practically no one I can think of who's better qualified to talk about research standards, impact and funding and what we expect from the UKRI. And you will have a chance to answer questions afterwards, so please, just a reminder, send them on Slido. Thank you. Over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's absolutely great to be here, and happy birthday to the Social Research Association. It's really great to be here speaking, I think, on your 40th birthday. I might be reasonably qualified to talk about the things that Beverly said, but I'm also going to talk about a few others as well. So bear with me, I'm going to give a little bit of a trot through history, which will explain why I've talked about the frontiers of science. I'm talking about people and the frontiers of science, because we're talking a lot about science and innovation these days. So as Beverly said, I'm the Executive Chair of the Economic and Social Research Council, and I'm also the Executive Chair lead for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for UK Research and Innovation's over 7,000 staff, and actually aiming, I'm an optimist, to improve outcomes for the research and innovation landscape as a whole with respect to EDI. So we're working on our strategy for the coming years in the ESRC, and I'm also in the process of developing a strategy for improving outcomes on equality, diversity and inclusion with a new external advisory group and drawing on long-standing expertise from across the councils, the 9 bodies that make up UKRI. So as Beverly said, I'm also a Professor of Public Policy at King's College London, where I used to run the Policy Institute. And that's an interesting, unusual, potentially, collection of things. So how did I end up doing all of this? I'll say a little bit about that, because I think it's relevant. As a doctoral student in social and political sciences decades ago, I was interested in and really excited by the potential for research to help better understand the great challenges of our time, whether that was inequalities, violence, how we run work in organizations, how we improve educational outcomes. But I was struck by how little really systematic connection there was between the excellent, largely publicly funded research I was coming across and those in government, clinicians, teachers, and everyone else in a position to make a difference to many people's lives. Now, of course, many of you are responsible for research in or around government and policy yourselves and play such an important role in this ecosystem and the connectivity between research outside government and decision-making inside. So that's a crucial role. But I'm talking about this join-up between the kind of outside research base, beyond government, and what's happening within. So I became an academic after my PhD, but with a growing interest in finding ways to close that gap between research and policy and decision-making. And this led me to help grow and lead research in an independent, policy-focused research organization for several years myself. But that was before returning to academia. So I called myself a recovering academic for many years, and now then I lapsed again. But anyway, now I've moved on. So I returned to academia, though, in the context of changes to the research excellence framework and changes to policymakers and the wider public's, I think, expectations of what research would deliver for the public good. Which meant, together, and several other things that were changing, that many universities were starting to set up policy institutes and other kinds of more translational facilities, in part to address exactly the gap that I had also identified all those years ago. So in my view, and I think a theme in what I want to say today, is that questions about this relationship between research and decisions that affect people's lives, between science and the public, are really not new. But with many changes in the landscape and significant technological, scientific, and medical advances, they certainly seem at least as important as ever, and perhaps more so. So, I'll just quickly touch on a few aspects of the changing context in which all these great advances are needed and in many cases are occurring. And then also the changing research landscape in which we're all operating. And there are so many, I think, impressive researchers here today, some of whom I've already met. And then I'll also just say a few thoughts about social science in this landscape. And none of this is intended to be comprehensive. I'm going to be kept sternly to time, I believe. So it's really a trot through to raise some questions, hopefully, for further discussion. So just to talk about, or mention really, a few of the many relevant changes and aspects of this wider context. Because change isn't new, but we are living in a time characterized by a number of very dramatic and rapid changes, creating new and complicated challenges. So the UK, like many other industrialized societies, is in the midst of major demographic shift. And aging populations, for example, pose a whole number of questions around how we ensure that people continue to live well in older age, how we function as communities, the role of different institutions and groups in achieving a healthy, fair, and prosperous society. We also face huge environmental challenges globally and in tackling climate change and its consequences, whether health, energy, food, migration, infrastructure, all of which will come into play. And new technology is undoubtedly helping us to address some of the problems and challenges coming our way and improving how we do many things, but it's also creating many new issues of its own as our ways of living, working, and interacting change as well. So, as we can see from these global challenges taking place, they are actually taking place in the context of a very different economy than that of, say, the greater past, but particularly the context in which, say, the research councils were set up. So since the middle of the last century, we've seen a shift from strong manufacturing-based economy to one in which services are even more the dominant sector than ever before. And we can see that really very stark difference here. Now, I would suggest that this shift has implications for pretty much every aspect of our lives, who we interact with and in what contexts, both on a local level and when we consider the UK's place in the world. Now, if we look at the timeline of that particular change in a bit more detail, you can see here that in the past 100 years or so, with a different view from the snapshot before, that this dramatic shift to a far greater proportion of people working in services in the context of those wider changes to our economy. So, as I mentioned, our research base was shaped and developed in a context in which R&D that was needed was mainly for manufacturing and production, while far more of the R&D we need now to improve the effectiveness of what we are doing is to do with people, choices, and behavior. Because services ultimately are about how people engage and interact with our public and private services. And this shift has also been reflected in both change and in continuity, I would argue, in perceptions of the social sciences, as the social sciences in Britain have evolved over this period. So one of the areas around which there's been very significant discussion in this new context is whether all this challenge-led funding that's increasingly coming into play is pulling us away from more basic social science, focusing on the health of the disciplines, social science questions, issues, and preoccupations which extend beyond policy cycles and existing agendas. I don't think it has to be either or. I think it's worth going back to some of the discussions that began long before the establishment of a separate funding council for social science, just to put these discussions in perspective. So, as you may well be aware, and this is also the 100 years birthday of the Haldane Report, the UK Research Councils have their origins in the aftermath of the First World War, when Lord Haldane set out formal proposals for ensuring that independent, opportunity-led health research continued separately from research undertaken for government departments to inform their decision-making. This led to the formation of the MRC. But moving forward to the 1940s, the country was again emerging from war, and there was widespread recognition of the successful role that science had played in war efforts. Government was concerned to ensure ongoing support for the three councils that already existed at this point: medicine, agriculture, and scientific and industrial research. And there was also recognition of the value of statistical and economic functions set up during the war to ensure data for making policy decisions and tracking trends was available. And it was this interest that led to a committee being appointed to consider whether it would be useful to add a fourth council for research into economic and social questions. The Clapham Committee explored this question. John Clapham was a leading economist at the time, and published its findings in 1946, concluding that this was not the right time for a council to be established, for interesting reasons, I think. The first was to avoid diverting the best men, and luckily today we're also concerned about what women do in research, but to avoid diverting the best men from doing research to coordinating research, and to avoid what they called the danger of a premature crystallization of spurious orthodoxies. Well, we can discuss that later if you want, but instead, a standing interdepartmental economic and social research committee was established to survey and advise on research in government departments. Over the next couple of decades, discussions continued on the pros and cons of social science. So the more things change, right? But political support grew anyway during that time, accompanied by an expansion of social science research and teaching across universities. So that eventually the Hayworth Committee was appointed in 1963 to review research in the field of social studies and advise if changes were needed in the support and coordination of the base. So the resulting report, published in '65, proved to be a real turning point for the social sciences. It made a very strong case for establishing a research council, which the Secretary of State for Education at the time, Anthony Crosland, persuaded the government to do. He then appointed Michael Young as the first chair, and as was announced in the Times, the social sciences had arrived. And the Social Science Research Council was established in 1965 under the Science and Technology Act. The article does say that social research, and I quote, still had some fairly bizarre ventures sailing under its flag. It acknowledged that there was now much wider recognition of what social research can or would do to limit the uncertainties in the midst of which policies must be prepared and decisions taken and evaluated. And I think that's a worthwhile statement to have in mind. However, the debate about the role of social science didn't end with the formation of the SSRC, and discussions around issues like disciplinary scope and application of research continued. Some remaining debates led to another review in the early 1980s by a commission chaired by Lord Rothschild. This questioned the status of the SSRC as a research council and explored whether some parts of its work should be transferred elsewhere. Actually, many expected the worst, but the Rothschild review ended up recommending a stronger focus on empirical research and areas of public concern, but it didn't conclude that there was no longer a case for a research council. In fact, it was relaunched as the Economic and Social Research Council in 1983, but persisted from there. And so, as you can see, in the century since the establishment of the UK's research councils, and certainly for the just over half a century for which the SSRC, then ESRC, has been a part of this landscape, we've seen the context in which we've been operating change very dramatically. And I think it's right that in this shifting landscape, we keep questioning how we can best work to support research and improve outcomes for society. And as you may be aware, this has indeed continued, and most recently with the Nurse Review, which was published in 2015. So the review carried out by Sir Paul Nurse had its origins in the government's 2014 Science and Innovation Strategy. And the review concluded that the research endeavor has to be permeable and fluid, allowing ready transfer of ideas, skills, and people in all directions. And that applied research must be based on both knowledge of the relevant phenomena and an understanding of the societal, customer, and market or policy needs. And finally, the recommendation was to establish a mechanism to deal with cross-cutting issues such as the support of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research, grand challenges, and redistribution of resource between research councils in response to new developments. So that's quite a big remit. UK Research and Innovation was born mainly out of that in April of this year. And here's just a snapshot of what UKRI announced itself as aiming to do. I won't read through the slide because we will run out of time. And here's a list of several of the large cross-cutting funds that are being funded through UK Research and Innovation and with which the 9 bodies are working together to shape and create calls for funding. Now, here's what I call a high-level schematic. That's to say it's very, very noddy, of the ecosystem I think we're all working in, with just a few examples of each and where I think there's been some interesting progress. So obviously, there have been increasing focus on research applying itself to societal challenges, and there have been many initiatives to start to try to address that. And then in policy, there have been a range of kind of types of movements, developing relationships and interactions, which can help also inform that process. And then there are some facilitating structures and funders that I think are trying to work in that space. Now, one of the areas that I think is probably worthy of particular note, and I think is starting to shape quite a lot of thinking and activity, is that of the areas of research interest. So the areas of research interest were also established partly in response to the Nurse Review with the aim of setting out more strategically the government's approach to departmental research programs. By clarifying what government departments saw as the most important research questions facing them, the ARIs then aimed to improve the dialogue between researchers and policymakers, and enable departments to access and use evidence more effectively in their decision-making, which was a key recommendation of the Haldane report 100 years ago as well. We carried out our own analysis in the ESRC of the areas of research interest. So hopefully it wasn't biased by the fact that it was the ESRC, but unfortunately this was just before the Home Office submitted its own first goes at an area of research interest. And we wanted to look at how many of the questions that were included were primarily areas for social science. I think there were 790 something at the time, 92 I think, and now there are just over 800. So how many do you think were social science? 12%? Let's get a bit of audience participation. 34%? 58%? A few people have raised their hands. Yes, very cautious. When I did this in Oxford, nobody raised their hands. Okay, well done. Thank you. And 63%. Yeah. So that's correct. 63% at the time of analysis before the Home Office publication. Now it's gone up to 68%, and we still don't have all of them in. But look, the main point is just that so many of the questions facing government departments are about people and their interactions with the services and the big questions that the departments are trying to address and improve. So there's a kind of graphic of that. Of course, there are further than 13% now. I think it's up to an additional 15%, which start from other areas than social science, but actually really need social science to help address them. So what might we want to think about in terms of the social science that's needed for today? Of course, lots of the things we've just been talking about require ongoing social science, and these areas of research interest articulate many interesting areas for social science, like how do we keep people who are not very well, how do we help them get better quickly, how do we help them stay in work if they might need additional structures around that to make work more accessible or hospitable for them, and so on. So these are good social science questions. But if we think about the new context of UKRI and some of the things that are coming up in the cross-cutting funds, rather than, say, starting from ESRC's core budget, these are the 4 areas that have been set out as grand challenges, if you like. And many of these also contain significant areas of social science research focus. So the new investment, amounting to several billions over the next few years, is opening up new areas where social science can make a significant contribution, in my view. And that's where I'd like to focus a bit now. Social science questions and issues, as it won't be a surprise to any of you, can be integral to many scientific, medical, and technological advances. In the examples on the slide here, in these grand challenges, but elsewhere as well. In many ways, these involve working in partnership with other fields, disciplines, and indeed new sectors. But the changes we are seeing to the research landscape, both structurally and in the way that research is funded, actually are trying to open up opportunities to do this. And look, I know it's not easy. Sometimes the way they're articulated doesn't actually make it easy to see where the social science is in them. And this is where I think we as a social science community can help wider funders and help the articulation of the challenges so that they're informed by social science thinking early. And believe me, I'm working on that, as is my team. So we need to make sure that we continue to pursue deep expertise and investigator-led curiosity-driven research within and across disciplines. But in addition to research, say, about people and societal change, it's also important that some of this broad research landscape harnesses all that knowledge and applies the deep skills and expertise and methods to address current and forthcoming challenges. So I've listed a few of the kinds of questions that I think social science can help us explore in this new landscape, as it always has elsewhere as well. And in particular, while the important challenges identified often face society as a whole, I think it's really important that we remain very aware that different groups will experience them in different ways, and that we respect the diversity of the population of communities, the differences in resources and in their abilities to engage with and benefit from advances in science, technology, and medicine, as well as the potential for these advances to help or to hinder different groups and to improve or exacerbate different outcomes. In fact, we're now beginning to see some very concrete evidence around some of the gaps in our current understanding as a consequence of not always being able to take into account diversity. For example, Melinda Mills' work on genomics, which shows that we have a very narrow sample base for the work that's gone on to date in genomics, which means that the conclusions we're drawing are mainly drawn about white European men. So with the increased tailoring of healthcare through things like personalized medicine, we do risk limiting the benefits for some groups if we don't include them in the research and if they're not some of the researchers indeed. I'll give a couple of quick examples, but this is at least a part of what the social sciences can help us understand, providing a different lens in this time of change as wider developments forge ahead. So, for example, if we start at one end of the telescope with a fairly narrow, clearly defined question, at one level, this could just be a sort of technological solution that's being sought. How can we compensate for reduced mobility? Well, you might think a mobility scooter that would help someone with reduced mobility get to where they need to go. But actually, you can broaden out that lens and say, how can we compensate for reduced mobility? Well, a social scientist would say what other factors might be important. So rather than just reaching for the technological solution, what else should we be thinking about? And then, of course, you can bring into play a whole range of other areas, all of which have deep expertise accrued over many years. And if you take those wider perspectives into account, then it actually starts to transform the question. And you can widen out your view to think about how can we better maintain mobility, not just address it when it's lost. What's causing reduced mobility? How can we create whole environments and communities that are more accessible and more conducive to people as they age or with reduced mobility for other reasons? And then, of course, once you've asked the questions in those ways, you can come up with a whole range of different kinds of solutions, from technological to social and beyond. And I think it's that kind of widening of the lens that's a useful way of thinking for social scientists who are trying to think about how they access these otherwise sometimes very technologically or scientifically framed questions. So way beyond those kinds of questions, social science obviously is relevant to a whole range of issues and areas that are being looked at. If we take another example, though, an example where the answer to the question was actually social science that was going on and developed even before the question was ever asked. So the Ebola crisis in West Africa was a major medical crisis and affected so many people's lives, and there was a real rush to try to understand what could be done both to treat it and also to stem the spread of it. And of course, it raised a very complicated set of issues that went way beyond medical questions. And the answer, at least part of the answer, certainly turned out to be anthropological knowledge that was developed over many years about burial practices that were helping to spread the disease at the time, and that the sensitive knowledge and understanding of which would allow people to help move on those practices and adapt them and change them in ways that would be both respectful of the communities that they were trying to help, but also conducive to the improved medical outcomes that people were trying to achieve. So that was an instance where you couldn't just quickly come up with some social science to answer the question, but luckily there was long-term funding that had gone into that and brilliant knowledge accrued. So social science can play a major role in the face of very sudden and specific challenges and in the face of wider change. And of course, there's plenty of that. As you can see on this slide, most of the products and services that have ever been made in the world, well, no, not most, a quarter of them since 1 AD were produced in the 10 years between 2000 and 2010. And there's been an exponential growth in the availability of data, which is music to many social scientists' ears, of course. But as a social scientist and as a person, it seems to me that human behavior is at the heart of many of those kinds of changes that we're seeing in the products and services, and the imprint of it is available in the data. The impact of technologies such as social media and wearable tech is relatively new areas of research, but as these technologies rapidly become increasingly more sophisticated and integrated into our lives, it poses vital questions for us as social scientists. I have heard some suggest that maybe we should wait and see how they play out and then study what the effects are. Personally, I think that we need a bit of both and, because I think that it will be too late to potentially help inform and mitigate any risks that of distributional impacts and so on that might occur. So, for example, if we take the growing availability of wearable technology and the likelihood that at some point in the not too distant future we might have almost continuous biometric feedback on all different aspects of our health and well-being. And that when we have all of that biometric feedback on our health and well-being, it's very likely to quickly come with an expectation that we will be managing our health and well-being accordingly, that we have our cholesterol is slightly up, so we should eat less of that, that our body fat is slightly increased and we should therefore take more exercise and get off the bus at a certain time. So we're very likely to be expected to manage some of our health and well-being. And actually, if you take an example like that and you think about the range of different kinds of people and personalities and socioeconomic groups and beyond that might affect, people will be very differently placed in relation to that kind of information, whether it's the psychological resilience of having all of that extra cognitive load, if you like, or whether it's the resources that will be needed in order to be able to take the time to get more exercise, or use their money to buy healthier food, or take the time to prepare it. So there are a range of ways in which even just that increase in information and the expectation that we do something about it might make a big difference. But of course, if that information then becomes available to say, insurance, then it could be that actually looking after ourselves, the cost of looking after ourselves and of the medical treatments that we may need in future will also change, and that could also have wider effects. So even without that sort of bigger set of impacts. There are a range of different changes going on in that one area alone that we might really want to think about how they will affect different people, different groups differently, and whether there are things we should be thinking about as social scientists in terms of what we could do to mitigate those impacts, whether it's thinking about regulatory changes or thinking about training to deal with certain kinds of new information that we'll undoubtedly have to deal with. So the availability of data and the new technologies is one set of areas. We need to understand also, I think, who is actually making all these discoveries and who is innovating. And I think this is another area that social science can really work on. So at the frontiers of science and technology and medicine, there are people who are actually undertaking this work. And how does that affect the work that gets done and what they're able to know about people? Of course, this links to the wider equality, diversity, and inclusion agenda as well. Now, social science, I think, for today's landscape will strengthen the tools we have to grapple with uncertainties, to understand and act on the potential distributional impacts that some of these changes may have. But as social scientists, we also have the capacity to help model and anticipate future changes and challenges and really understand the implications of these. We have a wealth of knowledge behind us, and more than ever, we should have the resource and the capacity to look ahead. So it would be great to have excellent ideas from all of you in the years ahead as to what ESRC can be doing to help support that. My vision as Executive Chair of the Economic and Social Research Council is to support world-leading social science as we have in this country, but to make really to make its contribution to improving outcomes for the public as well. And in order to do that, we need to support the training and methods, the data and research infrastructure, which ensure that people doing the research have the tools for more outstanding social science. We also need to support a wide range of research approaches and funding modes because it's not possible to predict what we will need to know and when, and because deep knowledge and expertise are accrued over time. To bring this deep knowledge to bear on addressing the challenges and seizing the opportunities ahead, we'll need a diverse research base in terms of people, institutions, disciplines, and collaborators, because knowledge, like many of today's societal challenges, doesn't respect borders. And we also need to balance discovery and delivery, as I call it, building the relationships, systems, and processes that bring those with pressing questions closer together with the wider research base, informing the questions and the kinds of research needed to answer them. So however things change, understanding people, sorry, I haven't been clicking through, have I got lazy? Understanding people, culture, and behavior will be central to navigating nuanced policy and practice challenges, and to being the trusted social scientists and experts who are pushing the frontiers of knowledge in ways that are then relevant for and beneficial to the wider public. And you're, of course, all part of that. So I wish you luck in the coming years, and I hope you'll do the same for me, and I look forward to working with you on some of these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. We've had, as I'm sure you can imagine, a number of questions coming through. I'll put two or three together, and then you can answer those as a group. How are the ESRC and UKRI facilitating engagement between the social science community and government and ensuring there is the right expertise in government to shape research?
Okay. Great.
Do you think government organisations are aware of the number of questions raised in their arrays that are social science questions? And if not, how can academic researchers impact more to make that clear? Mm-hmm. And thirdly, interesting one from the, there are a number of independent researchers in the SRA. Mm-hmm. Why won't the ESRC let independent researchers apply for funding in their own right?
Mm-hmm. Great. Good
okay,
questions.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I'll take those one at a time. How are ESRC and UKRI facilitating engagement between social sciences and government? I'll start with that bit of that question. I think we're trying to do so in a range of ways, but of course I also welcome suggestions from all of you, and obviously not necessarily right now, but you know, as you have ideas, please do let us know. I've heard of so many interesting things that are going on already. One of the ways that we're trying to facilitate engagement is, first of all, just through, there's a whole fund called the Strategic Priorities Fund, which is ultimately over several waves, hundreds of millions of pounds, in which we have been engaging very actively or proactively with our departmental colleagues, both to help shape and inform the questions that we come to the table with, but also to think about ways to incorporate questions and challenges, say, for example, from the ARIs into pots of funding. So I think I wasn't in the previous context head of the ESRC, but in the current context, it certainly feels like there is very significant engagement between, say, the chief scientists and the chief scientific officers network and the executive chairs of the research councils and Innovate. And I think that is because we are very proactively keen to and concerned to make sure that we provide that kind of join up wherever we can. There are a range of other kinds of initiatives, and there's one or two that we're actually working on developing at the moment, so hopefully watch that space and you'll see even more interesting ones soon. But there's definitely a strong will to do it, and there are ways of, there are both kind of networks like CSAP, the Centre for Science and Policy, and other kinds of workshops and conferences and sandpits. I know DWP are themselves actually out with UK Research and Innovation and ESRC are engaging in lots of working with universities who want to answer some of the ARIs. So hopefully we can build on that kind of approach and go further. Do government departments have the expertise to soak up all this wonderful research? Good question, and probably not as much one for me as for some of my departmental colleagues around the room. But I will just say that certainly it is the case that good research, a good join-up between research and policy depends on having the receptor capacity and the intelligent customer to be asking for it, which means that departments need funding to do that. And some of them have more funding than others for that. Some of them have more of their own analysts than others to do that. So I would say it is quite variable, and hopefully that will also get strengthened in the coming years. So, do I think government departments are aware of the sheer number of ARI questions, which are social sciences? Well, if they've ever talked to me, they are, because I do trot out that number reasonably frequently now. I think some of them are aware. I think that there's a bit of a kind of a problem of aggregation. They might know that in their own area there's lots of behavioral science they need or lots of wider social science they need, but they may not know how prevalent that is across the other organizations. And when we put together this analysis, none of the chief scientists and others who I'd spoken with had seen it as one whole package, and so no, they were not aware until I started talking about it. So how can we make them more aware? Well, hopefully say it on platforms, hopefully say it in conversations, hopefully there are many other ways of raising awareness of it, write a blog, I don't know. I'm sure you all have good ideas for how to communicate these things, but I think it is important because I really think that shift over the last 50, 60 plus years has been an important one, not only for our economy and for how we live our lives, but of course what we therefore need to help address the various challenges we face. So it would be good if that's widely known. And then why can't individual researchers, independent researchers, bid for ESRC funding? I have to put my hand up and say, I have no idea, I'm sorry. I will look into that when I get back to the office. But it's a very good question and merits an answer.